Hi everyone, my name is Dermot Looney. I'm the person behind the History St. Pat's Twitter account and the project to research the history of St. Patrick's Athletic. This presentation is called For Richer, For Poorer, A History of Richmond Park, Inchicore. I gave it in November 2019 at Kilmainham Jail as a guest of the Kilmainham Inchicore network. And it was really just an investigation of a place that's important in the history of Inchicore and Kilmainham. That place is Richmond Park. It's the home ground of St. Patrick's Athletic and has been since 1939 with a couple of gaps in between, but it's a place with some extraordinary history that goes back much further than that. Just a quick caveat at the start, I'm not a historian by trade or by qualification. I'm someone who's interested in the history of St. Pat's and the local area. I'm not from Inchicore myself, though my dad is, so there's plenty of people who would have better expertise in this. And no doubt some of the things I say may be somewhat inaccurate or I've made assumptions that may not be correct. So if you have any corrections, please feel free to send them on to me, and I hope you do enjoy the presentation. To begin our presentation and to begin the one we did in Kilmainham Courthouse, I put up 5 pictures here and asked the audience there, the crowd there, to name those 5 people. So best of luck naming them if you can. And number 1 is Arthur Guinness, the famous Arthur Guinness, the famous brewer, who's responsible for a lot of the beer bellies you see around Richmond Park, my own included. Number 2 is someone who people might not know. His name is Charles Lennox, and he was one of the Dukes of Richmond, and he's the person for whom Richmond Barracks was named, and we would imagine from that the person for whom Richmond Park is named. Number 3 is Mr. McDowell, Joe McDowell. He had a long involvement in St. Patrick's Athletic, but obviously is associated with McDowell's Pub, or the Richmond House as it's also called, and was involved in leasing the ground to St. Patrick's Athletic in the late 1930s, a lease that lasts to the current day and beyond. Number 4 is the lead singer of Mungo Jerry. Now, I'm sure some of the younger people might not know who Mungo Jerry are. Mungo Jerry were a very popular band in the 60s and 70s, most famous of all for their hit In the Summertime. Now, what that has to do with the history of Richmond Park, you might not be too sure. This man here is Ray Dorset, who is the lead singer of Mungo Jerry. Well, Mungo Jerry and number 5 there, Phil Lynott and Tin Lizzy, headlined the first ever rock festival in Irish history, which took place at Richmond Park, and I'm hoping to talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation. We begin our history of Richmond Park by, I suppose, thinking about Arthur Guinness and thinking about the history of brewing. And there's a little bit of supposition on my part with regard to the connection between Guinness's and Richmond Park. What we know for sure is there are some connections. As people might know, in 1759, Guinness was brewed for the first time. It wasn't brewed as a porter or a stout in those days, but later on it came to become something similar to the drink we're familiar with now. Guinnesses themselves and Arthur Guinness, who's pictured here, also had an involvement with some mills in Kilmainham. Now, sometimes they're referred to as the Hibernian Mills, although confusingly that's the name of a later mill as well. And this was a flour mill. Now, you can imagine that Arthur Guinness, with his connections to farmers, with his connections to people who grew various grains and so on, would have had an easy in to flour, to the production of wheat and so on. Mills, of course, were so important in the 1700s and 1800s and right up to the 1900s in Dublin. And this particular mill was on the River Camach, which people are aware is the river beside Richmond Park, runs through the heart of Inchicore. That's a river, by the way, that begins all the way up past Saggart, in fact, past Brittis, indeed, in West County Dublin, flows through Clondalkin, down through the back of Drimnagh, through Inchicore, and eventually into the River Liffey. And nowadays it's a small river, but in that time period, the 1700s and 1800s, and into the 1900s, it was used as a major power generation. And there were many mills indeed on the River Camach, including a mill situated maybe 100 metres or so, 200 metres downstream from where Richmond Park is. That flour mill was owned by the Guinnesses, And as I said, it's possible that it was a separate mill or that the name has been confused with Hibernian mills associated with the Willens family. And they were woolen mills that operated for a long time at that location. Now, why are mills and why is Arthur Guinness so important? Well, I think it's perhaps likely that the Guinness family also bought land upstream from their mill along the River Camac on both sides, maybe to protect their asset. You can imagine that what's upstream from a mill is going to be important. If someone else owns it, they're going to maybe be able to pollute it or maybe even stop the flow or lessen the flow of the river. If you are relying on steady flow and on particularly clean water or just a good flow of water, you might want to have some control of the asset further upstream. The reason I mention this is we do know that the area of Richmond Park was in the hands of the Guinness family. By the 1850s, the area of the modern day Richmond Park, such as it was owned by Arthur Hart Guinness, who was a great grandson of the most famous Arthur. Now, by the way, the flour mills were gotten rid of by the Guinness family in the mid 1800s, so their milling connections to the area stopped at that stage. The picture you can see here is a picture of the later Hibernian mills, just an idea of what a water mill would have looked like at the time. So we know that the Guinness family owned these particular lands, and here are some maps showing the lands of where the modern day Richmond Park is. You can see the map on top is a map from 1816. It's called Taylor's South Map. And the map on the bottom, very similar, is a map from 1821. And you'll see Richmond Barracks referred to there. Richmond Barracks, built in the early 1800s as a British Army barracks, was a very substantial, large barracks that hosted regiments all the way through to independence in the 1920s. And Richmond Barracks most likely, either directly or indirectly, gave its name or gives its name to Richmond Park. But you can see in these two maps where the land of Richmond Park is located. So you can see the barracks and you can see the road to the north of the barracks. To the north again, you should be able to spot the River Camac. And the land in between there is the land of the modern day Richmond Park. So on these maps, nothing is really noted for that particular site. Reminder that this is the development of what we now call Inchicore. Had different names, of course, at that time. People sometimes refer to it as Golden Bridge, sometimes refer to it as Richmond. But we can see that the land is fairly nondescript in both these maps. So tracing the history of Richmond Park, there doesn't seem to be much of significance there, certainly not worthy of being mapped in the early 1800s. Bring us forward to the middle of the 19th century. The Ordnance Survey did their famous 6-inch to 1 mile map. This was in about 1843 or so. Very detailed maps of the whole of Ireland, including Inchicore here, as we can see. The black rectangle is my own drawing. It's the curtilage of the modern day Richmond Park. So you can see that this is a much more detailed map than the previous ones we've seen. And you can see that although there's nothing directly located at Richmond Park, there does seem to be the curtilage of a field noted. To the left of the rectangle on the map, you'll see a mill pond. It's now the kind of park there. There's allotments there at Grattan Crescent at the back of Richmond Park. And where you see A, R and P, that refers to the size of the lands that are there. And it's 38 acres, 1 rood and 19 perches in the old-fashioned measurement system that was used at the time. The Susan Vale, that's located to the north of Richmond Park there on the far side of the River Camac, is the name of the house that the Willen family lived in. And you can see just downstream from that, a weir and the woolen manufacturers, the Hibernian mills as they were called. So nothing specific on the site of Richmond Park is noted in this map, but we can certainly see that there's a lot of development around it. If you do look at Emmett Road, which is the road that Richmond Park is located on, no houses in front of Richmond Park as we see now. That doesn't come until a bit later. So by the 1850s, the area of what's now Richmond Park was, as we know, in the ownership of this man, Arthur Hart Guinness. We know this because there's a document in the land registry showing that Mr. Guinness or Mr. Hart Guinness leased the land on a 500-year lease in 1856 to a man called Anthony Murphy. The yearly rent was £42. The 500-year lease thing, particularly for people outside of Ireland, might seem extraordinary, and it's just a function, I suppose, of Irish property law over many centuries, in fact, that extremely long-term leases tend to be given and ground rents paid back rather than sales of land being so popular. Now, this man, Anthony Murphy, who buys this land, was a landowner. He appears in the newspaper archives of the mid to late 19th century. He was an Inchicore resident. He lived in the area, and he was involved in fundraising for the local church mission. And he was also, I suppose, politically involved in campaigning for the creation of what's called the Kilmainham Township. This is basically a form of local government boundary for the Kilmainham area. Now, Anthony Murphy died around 1867. And when he died, his estate was published in the newspapers at the time, and they had 5 separate lots of land. And these newspaper clippings from 1867 seem to indicate our particular land here, Richmond Park. So in the top image, you can see there, Lot 1, a meadow situate at Kilmainham, but it's Inchicore in essence nowadays, but Kilmainham is certainly accurate for the time. Containing 9 acres, 1 rood and 30 perches of statute measure. Houses thereon, so there may have been houses at the time, and situated in the parish of St Jude's, the barony of Uppercross in County Dublin. The net estimated annual value of that was £117, and of course the lease is there for 500 years. And a little bit more detail further down in this advertisement, which certainly seems to be indicative that this is indeed the modern day Richmond Park. The owner has expended on building on this lot upwards of £1,200, about 1,200 feet of frontage, road frontage being as important then as I imagine it is now, suitable for building ground, and it says it's opposite the Richmond Barracks on the Naas Road. Now, that might be confusing to people who know the area and know that the Naas Road is the name of the road further down towards Bluebell. But the Naas Road could very well have been considered what Emmet Road is now, the Naas Road being the road out of Dublin towards Naas through Inchicore village. The fact that it's opposite Richmond Barracks is the important point for us here. Situated in the most central part of the new township of Kilmainham, and it's estimated that the frontage alone would produce an increased rental of £240 per annum or thereabouts. So the lands we seem to be talking about here are where Richmond Park is now and going up to the front of Emmet Road. So most likely the Camac up to the houses that are there now on Emmet Road. Going towards the end now of the 19th century, and we have another quite detailed map from the Ordnance Survey, and it's quite detailed in terms of the buildings. This is a map of the new Kilmainham Township, and you can see in this map that we have the Camac River and we have Richmond Barracks. So this would be the modern day Richmond Park between the Camac, or Camac as it's sometimes spelled, and Emmet Road. There is no detail for any ground or pitch, but the buildings that are right in the centre of the image on the north side of Emmet Road seem to be perfectly matching with the current day Richmond House or MacDowell's. That's the building on the left, and the adjoining buildings, perhaps the beginning of those red brick houses that we now see on Emmet Road, including the house at 125 Emmet Road, which is the offices of St Patrick's Athletic. So this certainly seems to indicate the buildings that are there. On that map, there's no real evidence of any other pitches in the locality. Now that becomes important in a few moments, but we certainly see that in 1889, houses on that side of Emmet Road, and these are houses that certainly in the future are associated with Richmond Park. Just to tie in the history of Richmond Barracks and Richmond Park, football in Ireland is often called the garrison game. I think that's more of an insult than anything. It's trying to associate the sport of association football with the British occupiers of Ireland, and particularly the soldiers. There is absolutely no doubt that football was played by the British Army in Ireland, but it would be wrong to say they were the only people who played it. And a lot of work has been done recently on the very beginnings of football, which started, by the way, in Belfast before it came to Dublin. And it quite quickly became the sport of the urban working class. The folk memory at St Patrick's Athletic is that Richmond Park was a British Army recreational ground. That's the phrase a lot of us know at Pats. Now, I'm not sure if that's fully borne out with the evidence I have seen. So there are pros and cons to that theory that Richmond Park was used by the British Army as a football pitch. In terms of the cons to that theory or the questioning of that, I have not seen any documentary evidence to say that there was a pitch there used by British Army soldiers. I haven't seen on any of the maps, you can see some of the maps I've looked at a lot more, that there's any evidence of a map tying Richmond Barracks and Richmond Park together. And I haven't seen any pictures, any photographs showing soldiers playing football there. I have heard tell that there are pictures of soldiers playing football at Richmond Park, so if you have any, or if you've seen them, please do get in touch. But I certainly haven't seen that myself. And if we're looking at history, we have to question the assumptions that are out there. And the assumption is that Richmond Park was used by soldiers to play football, and there are certainly a lot of pros to that theory as well. We know for a fact that soccer was played at a venue called Richmond, Inchicore, and also at or near Richmond Barracks from very early on, from the year 1891. That's just after, I suppose, football is introduced to Dublin. There's no evidence anywhere else of other pitches nearby on any of the maps I've seen. The football teams that played, by the way, are the British Army regiments in Richmond Barracks. The Coldstream Guards play at Richmond in 1891. This is all from newspaper archives. Grenadier Guards in 1894. And in 1898, a significant team of soldiers plays at Richmond in Inchicore. The Borderers, or the King's Own Scottish Borderers, as they're called. They went on to play at the highest level of football in Ireland for a season later on, when one of the regiments of them was based in Victoria Barracks in Belfast. They played a full season in the Irish League. And for much of their time in Dublin, they would have been in the Leinster Senior League, so they played at quite a high level of football. That particular grouping within the British Army, the King's Own Scottish Borderers, are sometimes referred to as the King's Own Scottish Murderers due to their role in the terrible massacre at Bachelor's Walk in 1914. So certainly some of the regiments that are there would have caused consternation locally in Inchicore, but certainly we've more evidence of other football that was played by soldiers in Richmond Barracks, or close to Richmond Barracks. The Argyll Highlanders versus Yorks and the Northumberland Fusiliers, all the way through to the 1910s almost, Royal Berkshire Regiment and the 11th Hussars playing matches there. All of this is detailed in the fixture lists that are in the Evening Herald in particular. So football was certainly played in and around the area, quite possibly at Richmond Park, by soldiers. The name of our ground is also a likely connection between Richmond Barracks and Richmond Park. It's not clear to me if the name comes specifically from the barracks, as in this is the park associated with the barracks, or if the name is in fact named after Richmond House being the pub we know as MacDell's now on Emmett Road. It's possible that the name of the park, Richmond Park, comes from Richmond House as such, so it's more indirect of a reference. And again, I'd be very interested if anyone has documentary evidence or any other evidence on the naming of the football ground. So now we get to sport at Richmond Park, and football indeed played at Richmond Park, and this ties into the same kind of time period we're talking about. So a club called St Patrick's GAA club, very significant club in the early history of the Gaelic Athletic Association in Dublin. I think it's fair to say they're star-born bright, but for a very short period of time. This club formed almost immediately after the formation of the GAA in the 1880s, were originally based near the Grand Canal, and then they were based for a time on the location of where Tyrconnell Park is now, in close to Inchicore village. They had a pitch there which is sometimes called Spendlove's Field or St Patrick's Park. That pitch in fact played host to the second All-Ireland finals in about 1889. But by 1890, this club, which was seemed to be doing well, and in fact that ground they played in seemed to even have a stand, so it seemed to be a substantial sports ground. But this club were on the move again. So we know from Joseph O'Brien's brilliant book on Inchicore, Kilmainham and District, and also from a book on the history of Liffey Gale's GAA club, that this St Patrick's GA club played at Richmond Park, or at the site of the current Richmond Park. So you can see the image on the left. Again, by 1890, they had changed to new ground. St Patrick's GAA Inchicore brought off a one-day tournament on Sunday last on their new club ground situated opposite Richmond Barracks, and which is moderately good except for being a little undersized, especially in width. So that's a quote from the Liffey Gales history book about the history of St Patrick's GAA. So that certainly indicates Richmond Park was used for Gaelic games. You can imagine it wouldn't be at the size of the current pitch if it is indeed the same cartilage. Wouldn't be great for Gaelic, but I suppose at that time there wasn't such strictness around sizes. We know as well, I found this in a document on Irish sporting history, that it's likely that Richmond Park had to be paid into. It was a paid into venue, at least at certain times. This quote says that it's about an event that took place at what they call Richmond Hill in Inchicore, but it certainly seems to have been Richmond Park. When the St Patrick's GA Club, having organised a sports gala, was advised to erect a wooden addition to the boundary wall to prevent the avarious, or I don't know if it's avaricious, from enjoying a free view. And that is an issue which I suppose continues to this day, that people are able to see into the ground, maybe in the modern day from the apartments at the back, or people are able to sneak into the ground from the Canuck side, etc. There certainly seems to have been a boundary around the field, and a boundary wall, and a fence had to go up to stop people getting in for free. One of the interesting things about this GAA club who played at Richmond Park is what that might tell us about the use of it by the barracks. Is there a conflict with the idea of the British Army using this as a football pitch in and around the same time, or perhaps just after it was used as a GAA pitch? So that's certainly something for us to consider with regard to the possibility of Richmond Park having been used as an army recreation ground. This particular map was drawn in about 1907. It wasn't published until about 11 or 12, and it shows in great detail the housing on Emmett Road, and that's all of the modern the current red brick housing. So it was built approximately around 1900 or so. And we can see the field that is Richmond Park. You can see a kind of rectangle with the word river in it, and that is the modern day Richmond Park. In essence, it's the cartilage of it almost exactly. You can also see underneath that where what we now call the slope is, which is beside Richmond House, or MacDowell's pub, the slope down to the entrance to the pitch. That's very likely to have been the entrance to the pitch at that time as well. So the modern day Richmond Park and its cartilage is certainly in evidence around this time of 1907, and the fact that although there's nothing on this map to indicate exactly what it is, the fact that it's marked out in terms of a fence or some other boundary indicates to me certainly that sport is being played on it at this time. Inchicore is such an important place in the revolutionary period in Irish history. It plays a significant role in the 1913 lockout and in the 1916 Rising, and right through to the War of Independence. And in fact, there are tales from both the War of Independence and Civil War of activity in and around the ground. But there's very little evidence that I've seen until now anyway, of matches being played at Richmond. And one of the reasons perhaps for this is there doesn't tend to be as much coverage of football in the newspapers, particularly with the Great War going on. And football, in fact, shrunk in size in Dublin because so many people went off to fight in the Great War as well. Something that did take place around this time period was that the MacDowell family are in place at Richmond House, and they become such an important part of the Richmond Park and the St Patrick's athletic story. So the earliest mention I found where it's called specifically Richmond Park is in late October in 1921. It's called Richmond Park Inchicore, and it's a match between Inchicore United and Stranville in the Leinster Junior Cup second round. There is still some evidence of Gaelic games at Richmond Park, so around this time as well, Sarsfields, a local club, line up against Sean Doyle's, also at Richmond Park. And there are some other indications that GAA was played at this venue as well. Inchicore United, who are a significant, what we might now call a Leinster Senior League, what we might now call a senior club, sorry, were playing in the Leinster Senior League at the ground for at least 4 seasons up until the mid 1920s. It's the second highest tier in football in Ireland, so we just had the Free State League of Ireland, and that was only maybe a 10-team division at the time, and the Leinster Senior League below it. So it's a significantly high level of football being played at Richmond Park from this time. The B team of Dublin United were playing in Richmond Park in 1922. Another team called Queen's Park used it, and we see in the first, from the 1920s and 30s, lots of different tenants of Richmond Park, lots of different clubs playing it from season to season. In the 20s, the ground was also used for the Inchicore United medal competition. In essence, I suppose, a blitz of local clubs played between various Dublin sides. So League of Ireland football does come to Richmond Park, but doesn't come with St Patrick's Athletic. The first team to play League of Ireland football are a team called Brideville Football Club. There had already been some League of Ireland football in Inchicore with a team called Olympia. The Inchicore is in quotation marks there because it's not what might be called Inchicore nowadays. Their pitch seems to have been where Good Counsel GAA play over the canal, on the Drimna side of the canal. And they played there for a time, a small club called Olympia. Brideville were a more substantial club that were in the League of Ireland on 3 separate occasions, and for a time they did use Richmond Park as their venue. They were originally from the Liberties, and they entered the League of Ireland in 1925 to 26 with their home ground at Richmond Park. The Evening Herald covered their games, and Nat, who's their correspondent, described the pitch as a rather cribbed and confined pitch. So Brideville's B team also used Richmond Park, and Inchicore United continued to use it for that season. You can see that picture, which is very grainy, taken from the Evening Herald, a match between Brideville and Bohemians at what's called the Richmond Ground, or Richmond Park in Inchicore. And quite a substantial crowd seems to be in evidence behind the players. So Brideville's first team continued to use Richmond Park until about 1929, and their B team continued until about 1930. You can see ads in the paper where Brideville are in essence trying to get rid of the ground by looking for a different lease around the 1930 time period. Now some online websites, including Wikipedia, seem to indicate that Pats then moved into Richmond Park. That's not correct. The 1930s were a big time of change at Richmond Park, with lots of different clubs playing it. So for example, one of the clubs that plays in the early 1930s are a team called GSR, Great Southern Railways FC. They are an important club in the history of St Patrick's Athletic. In essence, St Pat's formed as a breakaway from GSR because the GSR head honchos wouldn't allow a junior or second or B team to form, and those guys, young lads mainly, went off and formed St Patrick's Athletic. So GSR are an important part of the history of St Patrick's Athletic, and they're a minor part of the history of Richmond Park. Sunday Independent covers one of their matches, and it says that the team was playing against the hill. And those people who know about the history of Richmond Park, certainly up until the 1980s, know that it had a very famous slope going from one end to the other. And people have thought about the size of that slope as being between 6 and 12 feet. I'm sure some people remember it very accurately indeed. So that slope seems to have been in evidence from early on. During the 1930 to 31 season, there was also a team called Belleville who played in the Intermediate League, using this as an occasional home ground. Now, why is that important? Well, in an early game for them that season, they had a match there which is a 5-all thriller. 5-all matches, there haven't been many of them at Richmond Park over the years. And Belleville played this completely new team called St Patrick's Athletic, a 5-all match. And it was the first time Pats played at Richmond Park. I think it's only Pats' maybe 4th or 5th game in competitive football. So Pats have a history going back with Richmond Park right to their first season, but of course they don't move in for several seasons yet. Later on in the 1930s, other clubs used Richmond Park. Municipal Athletics the municipal athletic team use it, and again we have reference in the papers to the advantage of the incline. Rossville, Leinster Senior League Division 1 team, use the pitch as well. Brideville come back, playing at this stage in Leinster Senior League football, and Inchicore Celtic in the Athletic Union League. So there's normally two teams every year renting out the ground, it seems. In 1934, a fundraising tournament takes place at Richmond Park. It was organised by PJ McAvoy, who was a publican at the Black Lion pub and also someone who had an association with St. Pat's. So the matches take place at Richmond Park. And you see Richmond Park being used in the 30s and 40s very often for fundraisers, particularly during the summer months when football season was on break. And so begins the St. Patrick's Athletic era at Richmond Park. In 1939, there was another fundraiser, worth support, it said in the Herald, a physical culture display for the pupils of the nearby St. Michael's Christian Brothers School, and a debut musical performance from the New Era Girls Pipe Band. And they featured as part of a fundraiser for the Bernadette Invalid Fund. It was 6p admission, and the highlight of the event was a hotly anticipated football match between two local rivals, Inchicore United and St. Patrick's Athletic. St. Pat's, as we know, had been formed around 1929-1930, had played at various venues up to this stage. So Pats had played for their first season in the Phoenix Park, and then they had played at a pitch in Bluebell, likely Bluebell Lane, sometimes called Flood's Field. They then moved to Chapel Izard, and they then went, after 2 seasons, back to Bluebell. But in 1939, and for the 39-40 season, Pats agreed, and through the work of the club and Mr. McDowell, to rent Richmond Park. So St. Patrick's Athletic moved to the ground for the 1939-40 season. One of the many clubs, of course, who rented Richmond Park at the time, but Pats were to become very much the long-term tenants. So our first game at home in Richmond Park was on Saturday, September the 2nd, 1939. It was a 2-2 draw versus the great rivals of Hammond Lane in Leinster Senior League Division 2. The scorers for Pats on that occasion were Goff and Whelan, and that's an interesting date. It's the day before World War II breaks out. Now, as well as hosting St. Patrick's Athletic, Richard was also used as a venue for cup finals for different league deciders, and even what took place at the time, inter-county football matches between the likes of Dublin and Louth, or Dublin and Wexford, and so on. Now, for the first few years, about 5 years or so, Pats shared Richmond Park with another team, St. Paul's, who were in the same league as them very often, and that match between the two, or the 2 matches each season, were referred to as the Richmond Park Derby. So Pats very much based in Richmond Park from 1939 on. And because Pats become these longer term tenants in Richmond Park, they start looking at how they're going to do up the ground. In 1944, there's a meeting of the FAI Junior Committee. One of the members of that committee is a man called Dick Neville, who goes back in the history of football in Inchicore to the original first ever St. Patrick's soccer team, who were formed back in the 19th century. That committee promised to provide assistance to St. Patrick's Athletic in their ground development programme at Richmond Park. I'm not sure if that money ever came. Perhaps it did, perhaps it didn't. The FAI would not have the greatest of track records in funding help for St. Pat's, but the club weren't waiting on handouts. In the 1940s, they organised a major sweepstake. This is based on a horse race at the Phoenix Park called the Phoenix Plate, or the 1500. That took place in mid-August. And a filly called Ladies View romped home in the race, and that was good news for the owner of ticket 9298, Jay Keating, who worked in the tool room in the Inchicore Works, and of course that connection between St. Patrick's Athletic and the Works, from which most of our early players came, continued right through to modern times. The seller of that ticket interest, and he was a man called Harry Markey, who was a great Pats player in the 1930s, later went on to become a referee. Now, in the late 1940s, St. Patrick's Athletic eventually get into the Leinster Senior League Division 1 and completely dominated. Now, this again is still the second tier of football in Ireland. This brings big crowds to Richmond Park. Pats are dominant in the Leinster Senior League. They're winning FAI Intermediate Cups. They are winning and competing in the Leinster Senior Cup against League of Ireland teams, and indeed are doing well in the FAI Senior Cup. So it's a really exciting time for St. Pat's, and it's a really exciting time for football at Richmond Park. Now, a man called Jerry McCord, who went on to play for St. Pat's, wrote a lovely memory of his time following and playing for the club. When he was a kid in the 1940s, he went down to the games, and here's something of what he wrote. During the World War II, at around 10 or 12 years of age, we were allowed to go to Richmond to watch Pats play in the Leinster Senior League. We knew most of the players and committee. 90% were neighbours or lived in the general locality. We never paid in. We would climb into Castle's Field at the Inchicore end, squeeze in under the corrugated tin fence, or chance climbing around the fence at the river. And if you were lucky, you only got your feet wet. That's an amazing story of young fans sneaking into the ground, but it would have been very exciting to watch those matches take place, that very high level of football. And there's great anticipation in the late 1940s around Richmond Park that St. Pat's are going to go even further. They're going to make that step up to League of Ireland football. So after dominating the Leinster Senior League, Pats were eventually granted entry to the League of Ireland, that is, for the 1951 to 52 season. They had actually tried a couple of times, and the state of Richmond Park was held up as a reason not to allow Pats into the league. So Pats promised that they would do up the ground. And they had a temporary agreement with Shamrock Rovers that they would use Glenmalure Park in Milltown. You can see on the clipping on the right about Pats seeking admission to the League of Ireland. It was a temporary measure to go to Milltown pending the bringing of Richmond Park to the required standard. This work had been held up owing to the uncertainty of the club's position for the coming season. If the club has to leave Inchicore, a quick return is aimed at, and the necessary work will be carried through with all possible speed, and the club headquarters will remain, of course, at Richmond Park. So Richmond was deemed unsuitable for league football, but the club had very ambitious plans for redevelopment. And of course, the club was waiting to hear if it got into the League of Ireland. It wouldn't have made sense for them to do up Richmond Park in a substantial way if they weren't going to be able to bring in the huge crowds that league football promised. There's one press piece which I saw which talks about a 20,000 capacity stadium at Richmond Park. And Pat's obviously looked at buying lands. There was certainly some talk of tunnelling, and indeed I believe a mould was made for the River Cammack and to build over that stand or terrace of some description. However, as these things tend to happen, it did not go particularly well in terms of ground redevelopment, and Pats were not back in Richmond Park until very late in the 1950s. So Pats were in the league and of course made that incredible start to League of Ireland football, winning the league under introduction in 1951 to 52. But they did that playing out of Milltown. Later on, they moved quite close to their home to Chapel Izard Stadium. That's a Greyhound and Speedway stadium, but it hosted St. Pat's for a time in the mid-50s with good crowds coming locally. And then eventually Pat's went out to Dalymount Park, the home of Bohemians, on the north side. And during this time, of course, in the 1950s, it was a golden era for St. Pat's in terms of results. They had great success in winning 3 leagues and winning the Cup in 1959. Later on, they win the Cup in 61. There's great achievements being made, Irish internationals, etc. But most of this takes place away from Richmond Park, with the first team playing in Milltown, in Chapel Izard and in Dahlia. Now, St. Pat's never left Richmond Park. The B team, it was a very successful B team that Pats had, won the FAI Intermediate Cup, won the Leinster Senior League, and they remained at Richmond Park. And there were occasional first team games played there. The first one I can see in the league was a match against Transport, great rivals of Pats in the 50s, that took place in 1953. There were some significant League of Ireland Shield games that took place in Richmond as well. But the development is slow. They do build a main stand. The urban legend has it that the stand was built with some metal that may have come hot off the rails from the workers of the CIE works. I'm not sure of the veracity of that particular urban legend. The plans to tunnel the Cammack never are fully realised. There's no doubt land issues around ownership and leasing and so on. And no doubt there were money issues too. So Pats do come back to Richmond, but it's not a particularly fancy ground even by the standards of the day. So the full return is in the 59 to 60 season. But at this stage, the golden age of St. Patrick's Athletic is fading. And it is very sad to think that in this extraordinary period of league and cup success that Richmond saw very little of it. This ground that is the home of the football club, the spiritual home as much as the physical home. From 1960 to 1989, then Pats are at home in Richmond Park. The ground sees little enough change during this time. Um, the shed end, which is called the John Minnock stand, was named after John Minnock, a Pats player who went to Charlton around 1969. I think, although the slide here says it was built at approximately 1970, I think that stand was built in 1969. And there is a clip here which I can't link to in this presentation, but you can see on the History St. Pat's Twitter account, or you can find on YouTube, of the ground in 1969. It's the earliest clip I have of Richmond Park come across, and if you know of an early one, do get in touch. It's Pats versus Finn Harps 1969. You will find it on YouTube as well, and it featured on a Monday Night Soccer program a few years back. And you'll see Pats there, you'll see the shed end, you'll see the Inchicore end of the ground in that video. Just to take a break from football, Richmond Park was the venue for a rather extraordinary event in September 1970, September the 4th, 1970 to be precise. It was the venue for Ireland's first ever outdoor rock festival. This festival was planned to be a major event for Irish music fans. It was due to have many thousands of people at it. It was headlined by Mungo Jerry, who were a huge band that summer, having brought out in May their famous hit In the Summertime. And so Mungo Jerry would have been a huge headline act to bring over to Ireland. And you might be able to see on the poster there a band incorrectly spelled, Thin Lizzy, their first rock festival gig at Richmond Park. And Phil Lynott is in one of those pictures there from a newspaper or a magazine clipping from the time. One of the other players in one of the other bands, or one of the other musicians, was Bruce Shields as well. So they played in this rock event at Richmond Park, which turned out to be, as the headline says there, a pop flop. In the run-up to it, there were plenty of scare stories in the press and the media at the time, particularly around the issue of drugs. And you're talking about 1970 here. You've just had Woodstock in the previous year, and you've had other festivals, you've the rise in counterculture, etc. So a lot of the newspapers at the time would have been dead set against this, would have ran stories about drug taking and violence and all of those kind of problems. And as a result, the punters simply didn't come. It was called a dismal failure. Something between 800 and 1,800 people showed up at some stage. And despite the work of the organisers in trying to mitigate those kind of problems, it just did not go well. The picture at the top, where it says pop flop, that main picture, shows floodlights being used. So it's probably the first time floodlights were used. These were temporary, of course, in Richmond Park. And you can see the fans there standing on the terrace. So a very interesting story in the history of Richmond Park, but one which didn't go particularly well. And by the way, there were also, for example, boxing matches that took place in Richmond as well. It wasn't just a football ground, but it is primarily for sports. You can read more about this extraordinary event on the brilliant blog Come Here To Me. So if you just Google or search the Richmond Rock Festival of 1970 and Come Here To Me, you'll see some excellent work done on that, particularly by Donald Fallon, the historian and Pats fan. Again, I won't be able to show you this video in this particular slide, but if you go to YouTube and search up 1980 FAI Cup Final, you'll see here a video of the great Charlie Walker and Harry McHugh as assistant manager, and it's the Pats preview, I suppose, for the 1980 FAI Cup Final. The reason I show this here is it shows quite a few clips of Richmond Park and the gates outside from this time. Some other excellent work on the history of Richmond Park was done by the Come Here To Me blog with regard to violence taking place at Richmond Park in the 1970s and 1980s. And indeed, violence was a part of football culture at the time, and to some small extent, unfortunately, remains. But it is an important part, I suppose, of the social history of football and of the ground. So the articles written on the Come Here To Me blog talk about violence involving Shamrock Rovers fans as far back as 1972 and the stabbing of a young man in the locality. It talks about a 1977 pitch invasion, interestingly against Home Farm, who wouldn't have been a particularly big club. That resulted in injuries to players, including Mick O'Brien, the famous goalkeeper. In 1980, there were also more disputes with Shamrock Rovers fans at Richmond Park. But the one event which dominates them all was the FAI Cup semi-final against Waterford in 1987. Again, there's a video available on YouTube. You can search for that. And I have it here in the presentation. Unfortunately, can't play it, of stone throwing and difficulties caused. It seems to have been instigated by Waterford fans, and I use that word advisedly because it's quite possible that they weren't fans of football at all. Indeed, a biker gang is rumoured to have been involved at the heart of this. So the quote in the newspaper at the time is that Richmond Park, so often an oasis in the turbulence of modern football, has never seen anything like it, as the thug element in the crowd of 4,000 chose to ignore the day's main attraction and involve themselves in stone throwing that left several in urgent need of attention. And for a period, the players risked injury as the missiles coming off the terraces rained about them, but eventually the referee, John Spillane, took the ultimate action of leading the team into the dressing rooms with the game in progress for just 19 minutes. Now, Pats lost that semi-final as well to add insult to injury. It seems to have been particularly bad violence on the day, and as I said, you can check out that video on YouTube of the terrible violence that was seen on that day. At this stage, Richmond is in a fairly dilapidated state, as you might be able to tell from that video. Richmond Park, as we know, hadn't really seen a lot of redevelopment since the team had moved there in 1959 to 60, other than the development at the Shed End. And you can see in some of these pictures a quite drab Richmond Park from the mid to late 1980s. These matches are against Waterford and Limerick, and in some cases have good crowds at them, in other cases don't. You can see in the centre image at the top the old main stand with the high wall beside it. But it was not, even by the standards of the day, a particularly neat ground, tidy ground, or venue with good facilities. So towards the late 1980s, the club decided that redevelopment was required and that they would move out of Richmond Park. And that did not go very straightforwardly, as you might know. The picture on the left shows what happened when Pats moved out of Richmond Park. We very nearly lost the football club as well as the ground. You can see sheep grazing on the field at Richmond Park. In essence, what seems to have happened, and there are certainly plenty of people around now who were involved then, is that the club ran perilously close to being bankrupt and was only rescued by a handful of local people, of fans of the club, and others who were heavily involved off the field, and was just about saved in time. So Pats went to Harold's Cross supposedly just for a year in 1989, ended up there nearly 4 years, and eventually, with enough funding secured and with a lot of hard work off the field, Richmond Park was redeveloped and Pats were able to move back in 1993. And again, I won't show the video here, but you can check out on the St. Pat's FC YouTube channel, 2 videos in fact, of the return to Richmond, that's what it's called. You'll see the extraordinary work that went in. Now when Pats came back in 93, it wasn't anything even special for its day, but in terms of the revolution, in terms of how it looked from before, it was a big change. The main stand, which was built, started smaller, I suppose, in the centre, and eventually was extended at either side. Floodlights were installed on a permanent basis in the ground. The Cammack Terrace, after a few years, was developed properly, and eventually the Inchicore end, after a few more years, was done up. It was originally just, I suppose, covered in canvas, etc., but eventually that was developed as a stand. The TV gantry was located over the Cammack side, so people will know that the modern day Richmond Park, I suppose, is the Richmond Park arising out of moving back in around 1993 or so. And finally, just very briefly, the return to Richmond Park from the 90s on has seen a second golden era of the football club at times. Wins of the league, which didn't take place in the 50s. Pats won leagues away from Richmond Park in the Harold's Cross days, but ultimately winning leagues back at Richmond Park was very sweet indeed for the fans of the club, winning leagues in 95, 96, and in 97, 98, and 98, 99, and then again in 2013. All of those league wins while Pats were based at Inchicore, and a couple of the league winning matches taking place in Richmond Park as well. Something else that happened, for the first time Pats played European football at Richmond Park on the return, and there have been some truly great European nights at Richmond Park, including perhaps most famously a win against Elfsborg of Sweden in the UEFA Cup. The record attendance at Richmond Park is probably from this time period as well. It seems to be in the Cork City match in around 1998-99. Although there's possible evidence it might have been the famous Gordon Banks moment in the 1970s. The pitch itself was lengthened as per UEFA and FAI regulations, and half of the shed was in essence knocked down. And at the far end of the ground, the patron stand, originally a temporary structure and then a permanent structure, has been built lately with the support of the fans themselves through the patron scheme. There have been other proposed projects. There was something called the Millennium Stand proposed around 1998-99, which would have been at the Inchicore end, which was a very substantial stand that never went ahead. And more recently, it was proposed that Pats would move across the road to the old Richmond Barracks site, or St Michael's Estate site, as people will know it, and that Richmond Park would be either left as a training ground or perhaps developed for housing. And again, that particular proposal doesn't seem to have come to light, although there are still works underway with Dublin City Council. The Pats for Richmond campaign was launched in the mid-2000s, when it looked like Pats were going to be removed or moved from Richmond Park, and that was an attempt, I suppose, to get St Pat's to ground share with Shamrock Rovers when South Dublin County Council were finishing the building of Tallaght Stadium. So a campaign group was launched by Pats fans of various generations, and noting that Pats have been, I suppose, at the heart of Inchicore at that stage for 75 years, and that people wanted to keep Pats at Richmond Park. It was supported by thousands of Pats fans who signed a petition, and eventually with the purchase of the club by Gareth Kelleher, Richmond Park was secured as the venue for the club and the home of the club for the foreseeable future. In terms of the future of Richmond Park, well, this has been a history presentation, so we can only speculate. It is a magic place for lots of us, but it's also a place that's very constrained, that's in some way run down, although there's a lot of good work done by volunteers to keep it in the best possible spick and span, I suppose. And we will see what happens with the future of Richmond Park. It's something that exercises Pats fans an awful lot. So thank you very much for listening to the presentation. Pats have been at Richmond Park for richer and for poorer, probably for poorer for most of their time. If you have anything to correct with regard to any of the presentation, or if you just want to maybe ask more questions, feel free to give me a shout. My email address is on screen. And please do follow our Twitter account at History St Pat's. There's lots of pictures there. You can search for them on Twitter. You can search for lots of pictures of Richmond over the years. And it is, I suppose, just to finish, a place that is so important to lots of us, that's given us so many great memories, so many great players over the years. We haven't talked about some of those players, from Gordon Banks, the World Cup winner, through to Paul McGrath, and then the modern day heroes from Paul Ozam and Eddie Gormley, through to Christy Fagan and Conan Byrne and people like that who played in recent years. It's seen so much great football over the years. So many players have made their debuts at Richmond Park, made appearances at Richmond Park. So it's the fountain of so much of our football memory as St Pat's fans, but it's also such a central place in the history of Inchicore. So no matter whether Pats stay at Richmond Park and redevelop it or move on to somewhere else, I think it's really important that we do remember its place in our history as a football club and its place in the history of Inchicore. So Guramaghwith, and thanks for listening.